Welcome back to Two Who's Review, the Doctor Who podcast. I'm Alex.
And I'm Fitz.
And today we're going to be looking at the Unquiet Dead. Alright, so this is a story that tends to get overlooked quite a lot when talking about even season 1 of the show. It's not one that you think about that often.
I must admit I'd actually forgotten most of what had happened in the plot of this, because it's been a long time since I've seen it, so yeah, that makes sense.
It's also the first episode of Revived Who not to be written by Russell T Davies. This is the first episode that Mark Gatiss writes. He ends up becoming, along with Stephen Moffat, the longest, in terms of year to year, longest writer for Revived Doctor Who. I don't think anyone from the Moffat or Davies era wrote in the Chibnall era. I might be wrong about that. Actually, that's not entirely true, because there is a writer in season 10 of the Revived era who wrote for the classic series as well. So that they would be the longest serving in terms of
really
years. Yeah.
Do you know which writer that is?
Yeah, I'll just quickly look it up now.
Yeah, that is interesting.
But before we get into the rankings real quick, as I'm looking this up, real quick, having rewatched this episode, what do you think about it?
It was pretty good. Better than I think remember, because again, I'd forgotten most of it, but the ending in particular was quite. It actually made me quite emotional, if I'm honest. Just the kind of the raw impact of Gwyneth's sacrifice. And there's some great dialogue about 2/3 of the way through the episode between Rose and the Doctor about morality and how, it's better to use the human corpses as hosts for the Gelth than to, have respect for the dead, which is an interesting concept.
Yeah, I think this is another one where it's the sum of its parts is lesser than the parts in general. Because I feel like there's a lot of aspects of the episode that I feel like don't get quite enough focus, and those parts are the most interesting bits to me. But just real quick, I've found the name of the writer. Their name is Rona Munro, and they wrote The Eaters of Light from the 12th Doctor's era, and they were also the writer of Survival, the final classic era story.
Okay. Interesting. Huh. I had no idea. Fun little fact.
I think they're the only person that has written for both Classic and Revived Who.
I'd believe that. I can't think of anyone else who, even during, the 7th Doctor's period, who would have written again for it, so that makes sense.
Let's move on to the rankings before we go too in-depth. On the Unquiet Dead. This has an average rating on the timescales.com of 7.2 out of 10. That seems about right to me.
Yeah.
I might go a bit higher than that.
Yeah, same, a little higher. But yeah, it saves, because it's a story that kind of saves most of its really kind of best bits for the last third, that's fine, and that's what you want in a story like a Doctor Who episode. You want it to build and build and have those sort of dramatic crescendos coming at the end. But though I don't find, in terms of story, I don't find anything particularly. I don't find it, inefficient really in any way in any part of the story. But I do think that the last third is stronger than the first 2/3.
Yeah, sure. That it's when everything really ratchets up in the last third. And something I was thinking while watching it, this is the episode of Revived Who that feels to me the most like a classic Who episode. I'm not sure if you'll agree with me on that, but I think it's largely down to the way this episode is directed. There's very little background music, a lot of scenes, and without transitional music into the next scene. A lot of the dialogue seems very like classic. Like they spend quite a lot of time at the beginning of the story with a lot of all of the parties separated and they're bouncing back and forth between them. We see the TARDIS crew. Then we go. The first time we see the TARDIS crew, it's a very short scene. Then we cut somewhere else. Then we cut somewhere else, and then we go back to the TARDIS. Like that is a very classic Who thing to do, just from the few episodes I've seen. Particularly Earthshock, where the first part of the story, it's bouncing between like the quarry and the outside, and we only see the TARDIS very briefly.
There's not a lot of sort of visual movement, which, as you say, kind of goes down to the direction and also the editing. And I do see what you mean, that it's basically like a static series of scenes, and like they're connected. It's not like they're, not narratively cohesive, in my view, but they're not visually, you're not sort of rushing through places. And you say it's similar to Classic Who. I think the last time I watched this episode, and again, this is a long time ago, I think even then I actually said that. It reminds me of an episode like, Ghost Light, for example, from, the Seventh Doctor story, and similar sort of period piece episodes, even the tone of it, which is very interesting. But that element of having it edited from sort of TARDIS to other area, and the whole sort of visually, for want of a better term, sort of visually static nature of what we're being presented with. Yeah, I understand why you say it reminds you of Classic Who, because even with the special effects of the Gelths sort of coming in and out of gas lamps and into people, you could conceivably do that in Classic Who. Certainly, I think in Sylvester McCoy's era. I mean, the special effects may not have been great, but they still could have done it. But the point is, because these scenes are quite static, you could theoretically sort of transplant what they're trying to do visually onto a classic story. So I think there is a fair bit of merit in what you say when you say that there is a similarity there.
Yeah. This episode has a 7.1 for plot. That's about right to me. I don't think, because it is a story that has a lot of elements in it. They don't necessarily like mesh as well as they could by the end, but enough side characters get their arcs resolved. There's enough interesting philosophical questions raised. For the first true time travel story of revived series, it's a decent enough story for what they're trying to do.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. I found the story itself to be pretty cohesive, but again, I think it just goes back to that issue of the last third was certainly stronger than the first two, because that's when stuff got sort of philosophically fairly serious, I suppose.
Yeah, and we'll discuss more about that when we get into our full breakdown. It has an 8.0 for acting.
Yeah. Although I will say, I found it was very funny. The opening bit for me was actually quite campy. Because again, it's been years since I've seen the episode, but like when Sneed comes down and just says, "Oh no," he's obviously, it's the implication is this has happened before, but there's just something about that, the way he delivers that dialogue and the way the scene's directed, which seems quite hammy to me. And I'm like, oh,
I know what you mean.
That's a little.
No, I know what you mean. Weird. It feels a lot like a Looney Tunes thing, where it's like, jeez, black circle.
The ghost got out again. But it's funny though, that is another element which actually kind of reminds me of Classic Who, because there are a lot of weird, sort of odd bits of direction for the actors, strange bits of acting, overacting. So that actually, I think, more than most places in this episode, reminded me of Classic Who. Just that one brief moment, I'm like, okay, that was less naturalistic than I remember it being, but all right.
But for the most part, the acting across the board is really solid. You got Eve Miles in there as Gwyneth, Simon Callow as Charles Dickens. both of which do fantastic jobs in this. Chris Eccleston and Billy Piper are still doing good in their roles. Yeah, it's a. There's nothing that stands out beyond that opening bit that like is very like jarringly off in terms of the acting. It's got a 7.2 for effects. Yeah, it could be lower.
I think. Again, you're looking at mid 2000s. BBC TV show. The Gelths themselves don't look terribly convincing, and again, it goes back to what I mentioned before about those sort of special effects Uncanny Valley, in that it's like just cartoonish enough for me to sort of let it slide, but it's very clear they want it to look more realistic than it does.
And it's a shame. It's a shame that it has become so dated so quickly, because like I'm sure in 2005 people have been like especially like with the slightly lower fidelity monitors that people had in the mid 2000s as opposed to like the upscaled HD monitors that we've got nowadays. It probably wouldn't have looked that terrible. It's just that with especially with 60p 1080p upscaling 60 fps whatever it is, like it draws out the imperfections a lot more than it would with the smaller monitors. So it's unfortunate, but like it is kind of obvious in a lot of shots that the effects are just sort of pasted on top of the image as opposed to being layered throughout it, especially in the shot where the Charles Dickens has left the house and the Gelth is coming out of the door knocker. That one is very obvious that it's just like over the top of the image, and it's not convincing that Charles is actually looking at it, which is unfortunate.
I mean the sort of practical makeup effects when the corpses are getting possessed are pretty good, but those CG effects of the Gelth themselves, they do stand out, I think, nowadays when looking back on it. And again, while for me, like, again, it's just the whole sort of atmosphere and style of it is just cartoonish enough to kind of work, but the fact is, if those effects were in Classic Who and they were worse, they would still be more convincing to me in their own way than what they are here, which is unfortunate, because it's clear, again, that they're not, the Gelth are not as realistic as I think the creators wanted them to be, which is unfortunate.
By far the worst shot of the episode in terms of effects is when they're looking at the house burning at the end, and it's very obvious that they've like green screened flames into the windows. The episode has a 6.9 on replay value. I agree with that. It's not a great one on a rewatch, particularly because of the bait and switch of the Gelth. It's not terrible to rewatch. There's a lot of, like I said, there's a lot of good stuff in it. It's just that, like, the twist reveal of the Gelth as villains as opposed to sympathetic characters, it does make the seance scene a lot less affecting.
Yeah, and it's kind of, it feels almost rushed in, because that idea of having, this sort of twist villains, Doctor Who's done that before, to be sure, but, like, given this is only, a single part 45-minute episode, you really wonder how much time are they going to be able to sort of thread that through, and because of that, it's a bit of a switch. It's literally, Gelth, they're these blue spiritual gas people, let's be friends with them, and then, like, immediately there's, like, some fiery hell demon coming through, and it's like, oh, okay, I get it now. Which is a little jarring. I think I agree there. I have to say, though, and again, this might just be because it's been ages since I've watched it, I found it, again, surprisingly affecting. Again, particularly at the end, it really... and I don't know whether it's a personal thing, it might very well be, but it got to me, honestly.
Well, it's not like the whole story...
Great...
It's not like the whole episode just crumbles in on itself when you watch it a second time. Like,
yeah.
There's still a lot of good stuff to revisit here. It's just not quite as affecting as it is the first time through.
Yeah, fair enough. Because I think, and that twist, again, because like I'd forgotten that was the twist, but certainly, like now that I know for sure that that's what it is, if I saw it again, I'd probably think, this is kind of rushed through. Like it works, and it's again something that Doctor Who has done before and would do again, I think, but it's just not as certainly not as shocking on repeat viewings, I would say. So I think I'd probably say it's a bit higher in terms of rewatchability, but I understand why people would say it's that ranking. So yeah.
Well, it's also slightly emblematic of a problem the Doctor Who has had before and will continue to have, especially this season. Like there's a far worse example of it later on this season. I don't want to say what that is just yet. I'm sure we'll discuss it maybe later on today or weeks ahead when we watch Boomtown. That episode is the one that has the main problem, much grander scale, but we'll talk about it later. This episode, 14 out of 97 people say this requires a previous story. No, it doesn't. In no way does this episode have any required viewing before it. This episode goes out of its way to like add in dialogue that helps explain things for a new viewer. Like right at the beginning, the Doctor has that line to Rose where it's like, "Hey, I promised you a time machine. That's what I'm going to give you." It's like, well, there's no need for you to say that unless you're trying to tell a new audience member, "Oh, this is a time machine, and that's why this is all happening."
Yeah.
Like there's not a lot in this that like you need to know about anything in the past to really get.
Yeah.
It does not need a prerequisite story whatsoever.
I hadn't thought about that when watching it, but yeah, I think that would make sense. And there's even like the characterizations even of Rose are actually pretty good in several areas of the show. So you would argue you may not even need to have seen the previous episodes to get that element of it sort of out of the way.
Yeah.
So,
well, actually, that is something that is interesting about this episode. It's the first time that we see any inkling of a romantic interest between the Doctor and Rose. Like after that conversation where Rose is like, Christmas 1860, it comes once and then it's gone forever, but not for you. And the Doctor's like, not a bad life, and she's like, better with two, and they smile at each other. It's like, I think that's the first time there's been any hint of a romantic connection. And it's like, well, where's this coming from?
Yeah.
This is... How good were those chips at the end of the world? That must have been a fantastic meal of chips. Like, get you guys instantly, lovey-dovey eyes at each other immediately. Like,
actually, I'd forgotten that she said that, and then it makes sense because then there's that bit where they're kind of just holding hands. I mean, it's where they're scared and they're obviously in trouble, but like, I think it is sort of a connect the dots moment, which is, on reflection, now that I kind of have the whole picture, is a little odd that they went that route. Actually, that earlier bit though, the
beginning of my pain.
I do like some of the dialogue that Rose has there when she says, you've seen, what is it, like 100,000 sunsets. I thought, oh, that's a
that's
good way of summarizing who the Doctor is and what they're about. And
it's a nice metaphor of it's a nice sum up of the Doctor, and we have this a bunch of times throughout the course of the show where different characters will describe the Doctor and what he does, and it's a very effective way of describing it. It's nice.
Yeah.
In terms of the overall season 1 rankings, this episode falls bang in the middle. It is both the 7th best and 7th worst rated episode of series 1.
Mm-hmm.
I can't really argue its placement that much. Like, all the episodes that are placed before it, I would say are better than this.
Mm-hmm.
And likewise, I would also say that all the episodes below this are worse. So I think that's probably why it's not talked about all that much, because it is like slap bang in the middle for a lot of people, and it's one of those ones where it's like it's not so good to talk. It's not so good that it's necessary to talk about, but it's not so bad that it's fun to talk about.
Yeah. It's very I don't know about milquetoast or average, but it is, it's kind of in the middle, because there are.
Well, yeah,
there's nothing about it that. Well, yeah, I don't think there's much in it, for the most part, that really frustrates me. Certainly, like from a narrative level, but and again, I did really like the last third, despite the not great elements of sort of the twist villain of it. But like that it's in the middle is kind of unsurprising.
It's kind of emblematic of something that a lot of fans have with Doctor Who, where it's like, because the show does get so good, and there are certain episodes that are like amazingly high tier sci-fi, when it's only good to great, people tend to see it as lesser.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I guess
I'm not sure if that makes any sense at all, but that's like... Okay.
Yeah.
Let's go over the synopsis and then we'll dive into specifics.
Yeah, sure.
The Doctor has great expectations for his latest adventure when he and Rose join forces with Charles Dickens to investigate a mysterious plague of zombies.
Great expectations. Really?
Yeah, that's...
Okay.
Someone had a lot of fun writing that one.
Oh, I'm sure they did. Huh, okay.
It's interesting that the synopsis only specifies zombies, because there's also, like... It's zombies in the first act, and then it's ghosts in the second act, and then it's demons in the third act.
Well, and aliens, really, in the third act. So, yeah, that's...
Well, yeah, aliens as well, yeah. It's aliens in the third act. And it's something that Doctor Who will tend to do quite a bit in the future, where it takes an element of either mythology or, like, horror fiction, and they'll turn it into an alien.
Yeah, they do it all the time. We're going to
see it
all the time.
Yeah, we see it in the future with werewolves, with witches, with vampires.
They did it with
mummies.
I mentioned the episode Ghostlight. They did that exact same thing. One of the again, pardon me for the spoiler, but one of the big cliffhangers is when Ace stumbles into this room in this supposedly haunted mansion, and she's clearly in some sort of alien spaceship, and then aliens come and attack us. So, yeah, that explaining away horror and fantasy elements through scientific means is something that crops up again and again.
And to a lesser extent, it's going to happen with the Devil next season, which is always... I'm always interested when I remind myself, oh yeah, they tried to explain the Christian Devil as a pre-universal alien being. That's always going to be fun to me to think about. But it is interesting that they sort of combine... Like, you know, they treat ghostly possessions as also kind of like a zombie plague sort of thing.
Yeah, especially near the end.
And that's interesting to me. I don't think that Doctor Who has ever, like, tried to, like, do a true zombie depiction and then pass that off as an alien thing.
Yeah, I mean...
Like, we've never seen, like, the dead biting people and turning them into zombies, and the Doctor being like, this must be the necropathogen from planet
X.
Trellian.
Yeah.
Like, this is probably the closest the show gets, and it's probably for the best, because you probably couldn't do true zombies in a kid's show like this.
I don't think... The closest that I can think of, and it's not even really zombies, more vampires, would be in The Curse of Fenric with the Hemivores, because, and again, as that name implies, they're more sort of vampire types, and I don't think they themselves individually don't create more vampires. It's the Curse of Fenric that kind of creates more of them. But there is a lot of, in that episode, a lot of sort of zombie imagery of these sort of mutated monsters sort of stumbling around, clawing with their gnarled fingernails, trying to get, the living. And the fact that they, turn different characters. But again, that's kind of more of a vampire sort of a thing. So I think you're right.
Yeah.
I don't think they've done a zombie thing really before, or even since. So, I mean, maybe I'm forgetting something, but yes, I think you're right on that note.
I mean, I guess the way they treat the Cybermen in Series 8 could be considered a zombie thing, because they literally use the dead. But, like, that's the closest it's come.
I mean, maybe,
anyway.
Yeah.
What were you going to say?
I mean, the closest thing may be the brain of Morbius is clearly a reinterpretation of the Frankenstein myth, so that kind of counts.
Yeah,
but again, that's kind of a separate thing.
Yeah. This is another good episode for the Doctor.
Yeah.
And in this one, Chris gets to do something a little different that we've seen in the past. Like, he really gets to show, like, the enthusiastic nature of the Doctor, like when he's fanboying to Charles Dickens.
Yeah.
It's a really nice moment, and it's because of the whole context at the time, or I don't think we've seen the Doctor this enthusiastic before. Like, he's been, he's been jolly and happy in moments, but he's never been like, oh, wow!
Yeah. And certainly, I think not this consistently. I mean, you've got that one moment in The End of the World when he's bopping along to Tainted Love, but even then, that's kind of a momentary thing, and it's not as intense as when he's with Charles Dickens in this episode. You can kind of clearly see. And it is very funny that he just goes, oh, if you can't handle criticism, then I just find that funny.
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of great Doctorisms in this story as well, where he's sort of like, he gets into Charles Dickens' coach, and he's like, this is my coach. Oh, get in then. Come on, we gotta go.
Yeah, it's a very Doctor thing to do.
You can really tell that Mark Gatiss is a big Doctor Who fan, because, assuming that Russell T didn't touch up the script a lot, like, he nails that aspect of the Doctor. He knows what he's writing.
And in fact, I could actually, we kind of talked about this with the Sea Devils, that moment of saying, oh, this is your coach, we'll get in. I could actually kind of imagine John Pertwee saying something like that, which is interesting.
Yeah. Apart from that, there's not really much to talk about with the Doctor in this episode.
I did like
he does his job. He's the voice of reason.
Near the end, when he's having that discussion with Rose about morality, he said, oh, what, a different kind of morality? Well, you better get used to it. I thought that's a great bit of sort of confronting dialogue and really showing, again, this is what happens when you sign on for Adventure with the Doctor. You have to kind of look at certain moral questions, like, what do we do with dead bodies and stuff his way? Do we...
Yeah. I suppose this is a good time to start to talk about that, since we've brought it up. Of course, we do have, I think, our first moral dilemma of the revived series.
Yep.
That's like, should we use the bodies of the dead to help
this dying species.
Another species survive? Yeah. Like, of course, we now know that moral question is based on a lie, but in the moment, it's like, if we can use the dearly departed to save another species, but it would result in, somewhat desecrating them.
Yeah.
And, like, not really giving them a final rest. Is it okay to do so? And it is interesting that, there's not really a lot of... You can really tell that they're trying to make it a philosophical quandary, even though the Doctor has, like, clearly made up his mind about it.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes when they do this, they'll have, like, he won't be sure. Maybe, like, some of the companions and side characters will have differing opinions on it. They'll disagree. Rose is really the only person in this that contradicts or, like, disagrees with, going ahead with it.
Yeah, I think she's kind of...
So it's not...
She's the only one, I think, who has sort of is given a major opportunity to do so, because, Gwyneth is being possessed.
Yeah.
Sneed is just kind of terrified, and Charles Dickens is off. At that point, is he running about to turn off the gas, or does that happen later? It might happen a bit later.
No, this is before then. This is before they go into the morgue.
And
this is when Gwyneth has her whole, Rose is trying to say, no, I won't let you do this to Gwyneth, and Gwyneth stands up and says, well, I have a say in this too. You think I'm stupid.
Yes.
And it's so gratifying to see Rose called out, because this is... Okay, I've been nice to Rose in the previous stories. This is the first episode where I start going, you careful, Rose. Because we're not only getting the start to the Dr. Rose romance, which I hate. So already, not good. We also get our second occurrence of Rose being captured or trapped. So 2 in a row, Rose. You're doing some good work there. You're really boosting those numbers up for me, proving my point quite early. But then, again, like, characters are allowed to disagree with the Doctor.
Yeah.
That's fine. I don't have an issue with that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the way that she then, like, dismisses Gwyneth's opinion.
Mm-hmm.
it's sort of like Gwyneth is like, I'm allowed to have a say in this, and then Rose is like, yeah, but you don't know what's going on here. I just felt like screaming at the TV. Neither do you.
Yeah.
Like the Doctor has like laid this out in a lot of detail, and he knows way more about alien affairs and everything that's been going on. And she's allowed to have her own opinion, but she's not. But then to turn around and say something that could easily be said to her in this scenario, I just felt like going, oh, and then like Gwyneth rightly points her out by saying, you think I'm stupid, and because she's a telepath, we know that has to be true.
Yeah.
So she's defending Gwyneth, but she's also like, it's kind of patronizing in a way as well. I don't know, like I understand the impulse to protect Gwyneth. And Rose is very clearly an empathic character. She feels a lot of strong emotions, and when she wants to protect people, that's all well and good.
Yeah. And I think that makes sense with her.
But like to not even let Gwyneth have a say in it.
And I think
to just be like, well, you're from 1869. You're stupid.
Well,
the people from the modern era are talking. That's obviously not what she means, but like the fact that is clearly in the back of her head throughout the whole thing. It's like I said, it's not an episode where I really despise Rose, but like all the cracks are showing.
It doesn't bother me that much. Certainly in the context of just this episode, I think it does help with kind of again those moral questions and Rose's characterization, because we learn here that her dad died. Years ago, so
yes, yeah, I'd forgotten that this was the first time that Pete was referenced.
So that she wants to kind of protect Gwyneth makes sense, because she's already lost somebody she really cares about. So she's obviously really torn here, thinking here's this person who I've gotten to know, and she's funny and really human, and I've gotten to talk to her a fair bit, and I don't want her to have to unnecessarily put herself in danger. Now, having said that I think is a symptom of something which is true, certainly for Rose in this episode, possibly for Rose in other episodes. Again, we'll get into that and what you think of that later, but also with other, human characters that travel with the Doctors, that they can only give a human view of the scenario.
Yes.
Their experience is limited. And even though there are, as I mentioned in the...
Yeah.
With the Sea Devils, there are moments where the Doctor will make fun of people, for their sort of only human perspective. But that clash is an important part of sort of those character interactions, of realizing, sometimes there's a bigger picture here, and sometimes really asking, well, Doctor, is this worth it? And a lot of the times, I think the way it's presented in the narrative, the audience is meant to think, yes, it's obviously good to do it the Doctor's way, but still having those important questions to think, well, is it? Let's really discuss this. So I think that element of Rose's character, but like, is a key part. It
is, but like I think I would have been more on board with it if one of the other characters also opposed it.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that it's just Rose, it means that it's less about like a proper debate, and it's more about, well, you're the only person that's stopping the story from progressing.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just get him involved. Like I'm willing to concede that I'm only having these complaints because of how later episodes really irk me with Rose, and maybe there's some feedback on that.
Yeah, certainly.
But it doesn't change the fact that you could eliminate Rose from this episode and the story would be exactly the same. The only thing that you would miss is the Doctor, because the best thing the only thing that Rose does to actually progress the story in this episode is get captured, so the Doctor can chase them to the Undertaker business. But you can easily accomplish that by having the Doctor see Mr. Sneed and Gwyneth carrying the previously possessed body, and then being like, okay, those guys clearly know something, let's follow them. Apart from that, the only thing she does is get captured, and then she has some discussions with Gwyneth with further character development, which is good stuff, but she doesn't impact the plot in any meaningful way besides getting captured.
And getting the Doctor into... Yeah. I don't know, and it could just be a personal preference in terms of what I like in a story. I I don't mind if a plot of a story isn't super strong, although I will admit with a show like Doctor Who, it kind of has to be, because that's just the nature of the genre. Genre fiction often has to have, I think, strong plots. So, again, I hadn't thought about that until you mentioned it, but I guess that's correct, but I'm not sure if I 100% agree or believe that, because I feel like...
Well, again, again, it wouldn't be that much of a problem in isolation, but we're going to see that this becomes a pattern. And that's the point where it's sort of like, okay.
And I think, in a way, it's kind of helpful that I have a sort of a more fresh perspective, whereas you've got a perspective that's obviously been impacted by the context of the rest of the season. Neither of which is more wrong than the other, but it's just an important, an interesting point of comparison, I mean. So, I think, I might change my mind with how it goes with the rest of the season. But we'll just have to wait and see. But I understand why you'd say she doesn't appear to be that important in terms of the plot, but I'm not.
In terms of character moments, she does a great job in this episode.
Which is true. Yeah, that's definitely
like true. The conversation that she has with Gwyneth is
and indeed with
really good from a character perspective,
and indeed with the Doctor, and it also helps express theme, which is why I like it. However, this perhaps goes to your point in saying that. The episode, the sum is greater than the whole. There are a lot of really great little moments here, but, do they fit in cohesively? Even with Charles Dickens and his character arc, where... Because, here's the thing. From my memory before watching this episode again, what I remember was Charles Dickens being this kind of cranky, sort of Ebenezer Scrooge type. It's meant to be a play on the A Christmas Carol, that he's this cranky old guy, kind of mean to people, and then he meets, the Ghost of Christmas Gelth, and then becomes kind of a nicer person. But I realized when watching it again, that is part of his character, but it's not a part that's as clear as I remember it being, and because of that, when he becomes this sort of more open, kind and nicer person, it is satisfying, but it's not as much as I remember it being, and I thought, I wonder if the interactions are great, the little scenes are really good, but is it all fitting as cohesively as I want it to, or thought it, or used to think it did, and I think it might not be.
Well, I think it's less about him being a cantankerous, Scrooge type, because there is that layer in there, and we should point out also Simon Callow is an amazing choice for Charles Dickens.
Yeah, he does a very good job.
Such a great job.
And looks a lot like him.
Episode. But yeah, of course, but he doesn't start out as a Scrooge figure. He starts out as more of a weary kind of character. His progression is, have I thought everything I'm ever going to think?
And it
clearly, and then he moves on to, he moves from that to, and then he sort of becomes a bit set in his ways with he's seeing that there's other stuff, and his rationalization of these events turns him into that Scrooge. He's trying to. Using his worldview, because he thinks he's thought everything he's ever going to think and he knows everything he's ever going to know, his attempts to rationalize the Gelth in, something that he can understand sort of makes him kind of a Scrooge figure. But once he lets go of that and he realizes, there's so much more to understand, that sort of completes his progression. And I think that works in the narrative. Especially because, of the way the Doctor gets tricked by the Gelth, and Charles Dickens at the end ends up quoting Shakespeare. Yeah, there are more things that in heaven and earth that can be dreamt of in your philosophy. Yeah, using that quote to not only tell the Doctor, she who knows it when she died. Did she die when she stepped under the ark? She was already dead. We'll never know how that works. There are more things that we can imagine. And that sort of closes his arc as well, where he goes from I know everything to I know nothing, and even just I find myself appreciating that first scene with Charles so much, where he's commenting on the what he perceives as the needlessness of age. Once you reach a certain point in your life. You are who you're always going to be from that point onwards. There's nothing else. You're incapable of, thinking on new things, the creative process, all that stuff is like deeply fascinating to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think as a writer, and we're both writers, so I think that hit home for me as well. Like, obviously we're both significantly younger men than Charles Dickens.
But it is a fear.
There's no point dwelling on that.
It is. Have you run out of stories to tell?
Have you run out of stories to tell? Like, are you, I think all of life is about progression. It's all about, learning new things and being a new person with every new thought.
As the Doctor says, life depends on...
Becoming stuck in your ways. Yeah, exactly. Like, that's basically the ethos of the show.
Life depends on
and the fact that we're getting the entire... Yeah, and the fact that we're getting that whole thing in one episode with one character...
Is pretty good. Yeah,
I think it's genuinely like I mentioned, I found it deeply fascinating. I think that arc is one of the strongest arcs for a one-off character that the show has done. And a lot of that may come down to the strength of the performance as well. It is worth noting that it doesn't really that arc isn't really that important to the story of the Gelf. Like, you could put that, like, if there was any other situation happening in Cardiff at this time, Charles Dickens would have gone through the same arc.
Yeah. Or you could...
so it's not entirely dependent on the surroundings.
Or you could put, maybe not any other Doctor Who enemy, but another Doctor Who enemy, or come up with a new Doctor Who enemy that wasn't the Gelf, and you could conceivably have the same character arc of realizing, there's so much more. So, yeah, I think maybe in that sense it's perhaps not as cohesive to the rest of the plot as it is, but as like a solitary side plot, it does work pretty well. And even though, again, it was a little different to how I remembered it, it is still pretty satisfying to see him kind of jaunting off in the end, feeling happy. I also really like the fact that it ends on the bittersweet note.
Is like...
Oh, sorry, no, go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. Oh no, like the image of Charles Dickens watching the TARDIS vanish and then just laughing and looking away. That moment is, I think, one of the strongest images from this episode overall.
Yeah.
I genuinely like. I find myself smiling myself every time I watch it, because it's always like it is like a feel good moment to tack on after the Doctor and Rose discuss, the fact that he's going to die. Mm-hmm. And if they just left it with, okay, yeah, but we've broadened his horizons, he's more of a man now than he was, it probably wouldn't have had quite the same impact as an ending if they left it there. But the fact that we do get to see him laughing as he watches the TARDIS dematerialize, it's like, yeah, this is a good ending.
Yeah, absolutely. And having, again, that sort of that bittersweet note that, he is going to die, and he never actually did finish the story of Edwin Drood, as far as I know. It's been a mystery ever since he passed away as what the real ending was. But having that note, it's a very Doctor Who thing to do, and I really like that they kind of went there and organized the plot in such a way so it was near the end of Dickens's life, so that it all sort of comes full circle, and we know, okay, but he'll never complete his story, but at least he's, his character arc has changed in such a way that he's, as you say, a better person, for his journeying with the Doctor. So, that bit, certainly, that ending is quite satisfying. But again, that doesn't perhaps work as cohesively into the rest of the plot. I think perhaps, as I say, means that the sum is greater than the whole, which I think you also raised earlier.
Yeah. Yes. So we've discussed Charles Dickens. Let's talk about Gwyneth. I really like her. She's really charming in this episode. Eve Miles is a great actor, to the point where they brought her back in Torchwood and had to justify the characters looking similar when they get around to Journey's End at the end of season 4. They have a small line where it's like, we know someone who looks like you back in Cardiff. That's interesting, isn't it?
I think
that moment always like stands out to you. And if you don't know that the actor appeared in both Doctor Who and Torchwood, that moment is like, wait, what are they talking about? But like having that little moment there, it's like, that's a cute nod. Yeah, fun.
And again, a bit of a Doctor Who thing to do. And it kind of works though, because
Yeah.
like with the Doctor, like because it is kind of such an episodic show, you can assume, okay, well maybe they went on like a dozen different adventures that we didn't even know about. So having those callbacks, even if you don't know what the callbacks are, they still work in the context of the show, which is quite cool, and fairly unique to Doctor Who, I would say. But yes, as you say, Gwyneth is a really good character. She's very endearing, very sweet. The sacrifice she makes at the end, it is quite emotional. It's very stirring. Very
Yeah.
It's what makes that ending as strong as it is, and what makes it stronger than the rest of the story for me. Because again, it's a very Doctor Who thing to do, to have that sort of great sacrifice to save other people. It reminds me a little bit of a quote from the Third Doctor, which is not only my basically my favorite Doctor Who quote, but one of my favorite quotes in all fiction. It comes at the end of Planet of the Daleks, where the Third Doctor says to one of the minor characters, fear isn't just about not being afraid, it's being afraid and doing what you have to do anyway. And just, if I can get slightly personal about this, when I was a kid, when I heard that really, that got to me. That was a very sort of empowering, kind of inspiring moment. That's what real courage is. That it's okay to be afraid, as long as you try to sort of do the right thing. And I think that ending sort of proves that she's going to die. Yes. She knows this, but
and she's dead already, as it turns out.
Doesn't she? Because doesn't she take out the box of matches to? Yeah. So
yes.
I think that's a very Doctor Who thing to do, and it had quite the emotional impact, I think.
And they did a good job making sure it wasn't a needless sacrifice as well, because so many times you fall into a trap where it's like the Doctor cares about life, so if there's ever an opportunity for a sacrifice, they're probably going to be the one to be like, "It's okay, I'm gonna do this for all of you guys." And whenever someone else does that for the Doctor to sacrifice himself instead of him, it's always like, "Oh, well, would he let this happen?" And most of the time they find a way to get around it. And this time they also did that with her, having already been dead for quite a long time. It makes a lot of sense for her to do it. It's quite a nice moment when the Doctor realizes that and sort of says goodbye to her and thanks her. It's a really touching moment. I really like the concept. Like, this episode is the first one that brings it up, and it's going to become important later on as well. But the rift in Cardiff, it's a really interesting way of explaining. It's another thing this show does. It's another example of explaining away the supernatural with science, or like sci-fi science, where it's like there's a rift here. It's a weak spot in time and space, and as a result, you've sort of been hearing, what's on the other side, and some of that energy's poured into you, and now you're psychic because of it.
Yeah. Yeah, no,
it's a really nice way of
tying it all up.
Yeah, exactly. And it's an interesting way of getting around that, because there are going to be psychic characters and empaths in Doctor Who in the future as well. Each time there's a different way of explaining it, and just having it be a rift here, it's sort of like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it's going to become super important later as well. So I just love how, like, looking back, how tightly written this season of television is. Like, we established it earlier with the first time that Rose's dad gets brought up is in this. This is the first time the rift comes up. We get another Bad Wolf reference. The Time War is brought up again. It's a way of making these one-off episodes feel way more connected than they otherwise would be.
And it's clear with those moments that RTD clearly had a story arc and a real plan for a story arc, and it's those little moments, those callbacks, and those details that make it's true of most forms of storytelling, really makes them really satisfying. So it's good to kind of see them playing out in those moments.
Real quick, and it's not like we don't need to dwell on this for too long, because he's a very minor character in this story, but I love Mr. Sneed. He's such a good character. I just love the idea of this the Undertaker that's become so what's the word? Disillusioned with his own work, that he's the fact that he's like he calls the body stiffs and then has to like remember his place and be like, oh yeah, no, of course, the honor of the dearly departed. And then when he's like, oh yeah, I got the house cheap for because of all these ghost stories from the past. Hey, it's great for business, people love it. So I just love that kind of a character. He serves. I'm glad he doesn't like. He's the kind of character that if there's gonna be someone to die, it's probably got to be him. Because like he's not incredibly endearing. He's just kind of like, oh, it's this funny guy. Just he's good canon.
I must admit, it was frankly really disconcerting when I saw, because it's been ages since I've seen this episode, but the bit where he basically chloroforms Rose, I'm like, okay, well we're doing this. That's gross, and then it keeps going, and then Rose reveals, and she says, don't think I didn't feel your hand doing a bit of. I'm like,
well, yeah, I mean,
okay, that's really gross. And I think, and I wonder indeed, like, I suspect it's because it's kind of tricky, because on one hand, they're obviously framing that as the really disgusting thing that it is. But on the other hand, they're kind of passing it off as sort of a joke, and I wonder if you could just chalk it up to, oddly enough as it may be, but again, just sort of a sign of the times. Like, I genuinely cannot imagine you would try a joke like that nowadays for understandable reasons, but I think it just shows that a lot has changed even in the last 17 years. So it's not just
and
classic.
And that's another reason why it's probably the character died. Like, he's not an amazing person. I just found some of his lines really funny. Yeah, and then he gets his neck snapped. Jesus, I mean, that's brutal.
But yes, I think certainly from that really, really uncomfortable, exchange with Rose and Sneed, you think, well, if there is a character that's going to die, fine enough. It was the one bit that I found, I think, a little weird, because I then went back and just checked that moment, because I was curious to see how the Doctor reacted to it, and when Rose is having a go at Sneed, he's kind of smiling at it, which again, on one hand, it's kind of uncomfortable that he's not kind of doing anything, but on the other hand, he's, I think, quite clearly laughing at the fact that Rose is, for completely justifiable reasons, having a go at this old creep.
Yes.
Which is, and it's...
Yeah, no, it's not like he's heard that Mr. Sneed copped a feeling.
Or that he's excusing, or...
Locker room talk, good man.
Excusing or rationalizing it away. It's just a bit of a weird kind of curious thing, I suppose.
Yeah. Oh, that was the other thing I was going to mention with Rose. Like, the scene when she is trapped in the room with the coffins, and the girls starting to possess the bodies. It takes her way too long to realize it's not a joke or a trick. And we've been through this before. She thought the same thing with the Autons. It takes her... In that case, it's fair enough. It takes her quite a long time to, like... The Doctor has to explain that they're alien. It's an alien thing. Fair enough. But you've seen some shit already, Rose. And not to mention, the guy was already lying in a coffin. You've already seen weird shit with, like, ghosts and stuff. Why does it take you until the guy is, like, 3 steps away from you to go, oh, okay, this is real. I'm gonna start running now. Like, Jesus Christ.
That part, I didn't really notice it until you just pointed it out, so it obviously doesn't bother me as much, but I guess, I guess it kind of makes sense that would.
Like, if it had just been a single line, where I'd be like, you're right, mate, what's going on? And then, like, you can see the eyes are different. Yeah. The pale, white, blue eyes. And then, if that had been it, and then she'd gone, oh, I know it, okay, bye. This is more weird shit because I'm traveling with the Doctor. Yeah. This is what I gotta deal with. But it takes her like a full half a minute to even suspect that something's up and she's in any kind of danger.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. Again, I didn't notice it as much until you just pointed it out, but yeah, now that you have, Yeah, and again, it may also be because you're putting this into context with all of the other bits of Rose's behavior throughout the season. So,
Yeah.
my
No, I'm way more likely to scrutinize and nitpick
certainly.
Rose, and like, it's entirely possible that in isolation I'm blowing things out of proportion, but it can't be helped. It's you're gonna do it later on as well with aspects of
that's
Matt
true.
Smith
I don't
that
doubt
you
that
don't quite
at
enjoy.
all. We all have our, you and I have our own, picadillos with with this show.
And look, if you're listening and you think I'm being too harsh on Rose, fair. It's possible I might be. It's possible you're listening and you agree with me. That's also fine. We do, at the end of each episode, we do link our shared email address so you can send us your thoughts. I think we've mentioned it before, but it goes without saying, just don't be a mean person when you write, when you're writing in. It's like, people are allowed to disagree. Let's just keep things civil.
Fair enough.
I'm just quickly putting up the flame shields because I know I'm going to get some comments about how much I hate Rose. Let's talk about the Gelf.
There's one last thing I want to talk about in terms of character and payoff things here that I really liked. It's when Gwyneth comes in serving tea to people and she says to the doctor, "Here's your tea with 2 sugars just like you like it." Now, we haven't seen any interactions between the two up to this point. We don't know how she knows that, but that's a sign that she does have telepathic abilities, and there's a bit where the doctor's kind of just watching her as she's walking across the room after she gives him the tea, and he's like, "Oh, maybe there's something going on here," and obviously that's implanting in the audience's mind, "Oh, maybe there is something going on here," which is just a neat little bit of characterization that I really like.
I thought you were about to tell us about how in the classic series the Doctor would famously take his tea with 2 sugars, and that's a callback to that.
No, I had forgotten about that detail, but I had noticed that. Yeah, maybe that's like a meta thing. That wouldn't surprise me, honestly. That
could be.
That is funny. I had not.
Yeah.
But again, though, that.
Well, I don't know. I don't know.
Okay, I was going to say. I thought, is there some sort of bit of lore that you don't know about here? But
no. I mean, I'm gonna have to look that up.
But the point is, having that little detail showing us that, showing without telling us that, she's got these telepathic powers. I like.
Well, it's also the way she describes 2005 London as well, like metal boxes,
birds with people in them,
metal birds with people in them. Like it's a really charming description of the future.
It is.
For someone with the mindset of someone from the 1860s.
The one bit that I liked about that with the writing, and also what's the name of the actress who plays her? Pardon?
Eve Miles.
One bit that I really liked about Eve Miles' performance was there's a look of kind of genuine fear on her when she's describing this, brave new world that she is getting glimpses of. Like, she thinks, it's London, but not the London I know. There are these scary moving boxes and birds with people in them, and and people walking around half naked, for shame. And it's just I love those little sort of moments because again, it just shows this is what it's like when you travel, with the Doctor through time and space, and those sort of cultural clashes, I suppose.
Yeah, well, we're getting back on Gwyneth. Yes. I do want to move on to the Gelf, but one thing really quickly before we do is also like the subtlety with Eve's performance when she's, getting into contact with the Gelf. Like, it'd be very easy to overact those moments with like, like the like a deep breath in, eyes widening, like, throwing your head back. But she does it far more subtly. Like, it's only like a quick minor shift in her facial expression that she does. And that's incredibly effective because we can still see that there's been a change, but it's not like dramatic and melodramatic.
Because I'm sure, and I can't think of any specific examples at the minute, but I'm sure there are plenty of moments, even in classic series, where characters get possessed by an alien or something, and the acting in it would probably be quite over the top. So it's an interesting contrast and a change, I suppose. Her performance is quite good.
All right, the Gelf. Gelf. See, I'm torn on them. I think that... See, part of me is like, once they shift and become like outwardly villainous, they become much less interesting.
Yeah. Actually, yeah, no, I'd agree, because having them just be, this species of creatures that just wants the Doctor's help, that's the most interesting part. And realistically, I think the only reason they turn into, a baddie in the end, I wonder if it's only because they can make it so Gwyneth makes that sacrifice, and the emotional weight of that does hit home. But then you think, well, why did they have to make them the villain in the first place? You know what I mean? Like,
well, presumably it's because there needs to be a villain. Like,
well,
I don't think that there's like, I could probably count on one hand the amount of Doctor Who episodes that don't have a villain.
Yeah, fair. I think it's, because like you expect with Doctor Who, and I think especially for this season, they're obviously wanting to sort of do a callback to how Doctor Who used to be, the classic era. It's very much a sort of a, monster of the week.
Yeah.
And they think, okay, well, we don't have a monster. Oh, we'll make these friendly aliens the monsters. Let's, what a twist. Let's put that in there. But
I do think the concept of them is quite interesting to me. Like, they're trapped across the universe. They can only exist in gas. They can only get through the rift a handful at a time. So they use the gases emitted by decaying bodies for as long as they can inhabit Earth. Like, it seems to me like that they would have been just happy doing that for a lot of it. But as soon as the Doctor appears and they see, oh, this guy has an authority, maybe they even recognize him as a Time Lord. It's like, oh, this guy can open the rift for us. So that's when they take on the persona of, these sympathetic lost creatures. And I think the fact that they even drop the Time War as like a reference, I think that goes a long way to showing why the Doctor is so gung-ho about going through with it and using the cadavers as vessels for the Gelth. Because it's gotta factor into that guilt that he's got.
In a way, it kind of does loop back into Rose's backstory too, that they're both, the Doctor and Rose, to varying extents and for different reasons, they're kind of traumatized by the death of someone or a group of people that they love, so they want to preserve life where they find it. But that same desire is the root cause of their conflict in this specific episode. Even the fact that Rose doesn't want to sacrifice Gwyneth, but then she gets annoyed at the Doctor for saying, I want to sacrifice these already dead bodies so the Gelth can have a place to live. And I think I actually find it quite thematically interesting that that they're playing on that contrast. So I just think that bit was worth mentioning, because it's quite interesting to me.
And I think the Gelth also give one of my favorite brief descriptions of the Time War, because we always hear it as like a war between the Daleks and the Time Lords. We always hear about that, but I think the Gelth say something along the lines of invisible to smaller species, but deadly to higher beings. And I was like, oh, that does such a great job of painting a picture of because it's difficult to imagine what the Time War was. We do see it in Day of the Doctor, and I don't think they quite stick the landing with that depiction of it, because the way we understand the Time War, or the way I understand it anyway, it was like, this Dalek Time Lord war resulted in changing time so that a defeat was a victory and a victory was a defeat, and doing that so much that reality began to crack
and
in a way. And time began to die. I think that might even be like a description that's used later on. And the idea of that, obviously smaller species would be completely immune to that because time would just change around them. But if you're a higher being and you have a concept of time beyond a linear progression, that would be a devastating
Well, the Doctor
event. And when you
even says it,
yeah,
he says, time isn't a straight line. It's like constantly changing. We need to fix this problem now because it might impact, what happens. If you could be born in the 20th century and die in the 19th, and then he says, I'm sorry to
that always
that situation.
That has always confused me so much.
How?
I don't understand why Rose has the mentality of, I'm from the future, therefore I can't die in the past. Like, it's not like this isn't the grandfather paradox. It's not like if you die as a 19-year-old, you won't be born.
No, but
that has never really made sense to me that she has that. Like, it's obviously there to tell the audience, oh no, there are stakes to these events, people can die. But like the way that she says, it's, I don't know, it's that bit of dialogue has never really felt natural to me. It's always been like, wait, why do you think this?
It doesn't bother me terribly because I think it fits into Rose's character. It fits into the fact that, again, her experience is a very human experience. She's not used to traveling around time and space because, again, this is only her second time traveling through time and space. And it goes back to even in the previous episode where she realizes, oh, we're 5 billion years into the future. All my family, my planet is dead or gone off into space. And that the fact that she's very disconcerted by that, I think that does work in that line, just like it did in the last one. And the fact that in the previous episode where the Doctor fixes her phone so she can talk to her mother 5 billion years in the past, and how sort of weird and disconcerting that is, I think it all kind of fits together for me. I suppose, and like, well, when she's questioning, like, there weren't gas people walking around in 1969. When she questions that, fine. Yeah.
Like, that's a perfectly valid thing to ask. But the strange implication that because she's a time traveler and she's gone into the past, she thinks she's immortal. That doesn't ring true to me. That doesn't quite sit right. That's not how anything works. I don't know if I'd say that she thinks she's immortal. I think she's... Well, no, that's an extreme, but like that's basically the impression that she gets, where it's like, I was born in the future, therefore I can't die in the past. Just a symptom. No, your past self like can't die because you have to live to this point, but you're you. You can easily die. I think it's more just kind of symptomatic that, again, this is who Rose is as a character. She's obviously finding it very difficult to kind of get used to those So I'm sorry. Like, you're saying very valid things, but the fact in my head it's like, I don't understand this stuff. This Rose is being really stupid. Well, yeah, but that's who she is as a character. Yeah, I know. That's why I don't like her. I didn't mean it that way, but I know. Yeah, I understand what you mean. But I think I still think it is understandable that she, feels as kind of scared of this strange world. I mean, you could argue, yeah, maybe she should have had more imagination or tried to understand, who the Doctor is and, who he is as a person. But I think her reaction to realizing she could, be born in the 20th century and die in the 19th, I found it quite a human reaction. So it's understandable and it doesn't bother me personally. But I guess I can see why it would bother you. So yeah, those are my thoughts on it. Because I'd be like, in the heat of the moment when they're in trouble and they're about to, very well potentially die, and if I was there, even if I'd had time to process, oh, I'm traveling with this strange time traveler person and things are different now, I'd still feel really disconcerted that, my past, that is the future, can that happen if I'm here? And if it does, why am I, you know what I mean? So it doesn't bother me that much is what I'm trying to say. Yeah, I mean, it's not a huge thing. It's just always something that's stuck out at me. Like, what? Hang on, that doesn't pass the smell test. Is there anything else to go over with this story. We've had our talks about the Gelth. I think that like the concept of the Gelth is really nice. I think they're far more interesting as the philosophical problem as opposed to the life-threatening one
for sure.
But that said, I don't really know how you end that episode without them turning, because you have to either like where is the rising action? Where do you build to? You have to have like the Gelth come through. There's only a handful of them, and then you have to find another source of conflict, and it's difficult. Like
it is.
I can very easily see why they chose to have the bait and switch, because otherwise, what do you do?
Again, it's quite a Doctor Who thing to do. It is a bit kind of a letdown when you put it all together, because it's like, oh, okay, well, we're just going back to what Doctor Who kind of normally tends to do, which it works with in the context of the story on a basic level, but it is kind of a shame that they had to do that. But again, as you say, where were they going to go if they didn't go down that route? They had to have some kind of dramatic crescendo, and they weren't really going to get it unless the Gelth sort of turned on the Doctor and became kind of evil. There is one other little thing I want to mention here, is the cast seems very small, even for Doctor Who.
Yes.
You've got Rose, Doctor, Sneed, and Gwyneth are really the main characters. You've got a couple of Gelth, and then you've got Dickens. Excuse me, yes, Dickens. You've got a couple of Gelth and the other young guy who's working at the funeral home who turns into a Gelth. So I wonder if that's kind of, it goes back to what you said about it being a bit more like Classic Who, because Classic Who it is a bit stagey, very theatrical. And you wonder, how big can the cast really be? And there are some stories that have quite big casts, especially if they're really long serials, like the War Games or the Daleks' Master Plan, for example. But I wonder, and I will probably have to go back and take a look, but I think having a small cast is something you're more likely to see in Classic Who, so it's interesting to see that technique kind of transplanted onto Revival Who. It's just
well, it's also a good way to really build out your supporting cast. If you don't have many of them, you can really focus on making them way more interesting than you would if you had like a 20 different people. You have like maybe one or two focuses, and everyone else is just there to die.
And basically. It suits the kind of small scale that this episode kind of works with, because it's, yes, there's an impending doom for the world, but we don't need to see the potential impact of it to really understand how bad it could be. It also goes back to some of the visual stuff we were talking about. There aren't actually a lot of locations in it, like especially for Revival Who. It's basically theater, outside, the funeral home, the cellar.
Well, maybe that's symptomatic of because like when they were conceiving this season and planning it, they must have known they wouldn't have had a massive budget. Like the show wasn't guaranteed to be a success, so
they couldn't.
Like, I'm wondering if this was intentionally written, kind of low budget, just in case
that wouldn't surprise
the show
me.
didn't
It would
do too
also
well.
probably explain why Dalek, the episode Dalek, has one Dalek in it. There is another reason, of course, but in terms of like budget, that kind of fits into it as well, because it reminds me of something. There's an episode in Third Doctor story called Day of the Daleks, which, from what I know, is considered to be one of the weaker Dalek episodes. And I saw a documentary. I think it's called The Dalek Tapes. I think it was from the DVD of Genesis of the Daleks. Anyway, but there's a bit where I think the director of the episode was talking about it, and he said that he basically had to convince the audience that 3 Daleks, the 3 that they had, were like a squadron of Daleks surrounding a house. So he had to just keep showing different shots of the same 3 Daleks circling around the house with their minions with them. So again, those budgetary restraints kind of rear their head, even in Revival Who, because as you say, even though it was, Doctor Who at that point was a cult hit, it still was a show that had, definitely in this season, it was a show that had something to prove, and it was a bit of an unknown quantity, and I think, as you say, they had to kind of minimize how much sort of, especially budgetary risks they were willing to take, and I think that shows in these sort of minimalist sets, because even something like The End of the World, it's the end of the world, it's this massive cataclysmic thing, but then you think back to it, and it's like, well, how many different sets were there? There was, like, the main sort of meeting area with all the alien species. There were a couple of rooms where, the staff worked. And then there was the engine room down below, and that was basically it. So, yeah. It's just an interesting thought.
Yeah. Well, it does make things interesting. Like, I think that's partly why the Gelth turn is also so jarring, because before that point it is very low stakes. And then all of a sudden, there's millions of us and we're going to overthrow the human race. Like, there's no real build up to that moment either, which makes for a good twist the first time you're watching it, but then it makes it very tonally dissonant from the rest of it after that. It's a weird episode to talk about because so much of it is good,
but it doesn't all fit together.
Yeah, it doesn't quite stick the landing. But like it's still good.
The bits in it that are good, I really do enjoy. And I was actually wondering before I'd watched this, when we talk about it, am I going to say, this is where, Revival series really hit its stride after the first two episodes, which, again, then they weren't bad, but like, maybe they're really finding their footing here, and I don't think that's totally true, but there are moments... Sorry. Yeah, but there are moments, like the smaller moments, there's really beautiful moments, there's characterizations where it really does feel like, this is Doctor Who, we've arrived here. So it doesn't work entirely as a whole, complete, cohesive Doctor Who story, but those little moments we're starting to see sort of those bits of greatness where we're seeing what made the classic series really good, but also a glimpse of things to come. Certainly under RTD's era. So, I think...
Yeah. This is a really interesting conversation we've had about this. Like, because when we first looked at the timescales, we saw it was a 7.2 rating, and we were both like, we'd probably go a bit higher than that. But at the end of this conversation, I'm probably like, no, I agree, it's about there.
Yeah, actually, Yeah, because I wanted to say, maybe... I mean, I know, again, we don't do things by halves, but I thought said maybe like a 7.5, but... Yeah, I think it's...
Yeah, I was...
understandable.
I was leaning closer to an 8 before we started this, and now I'm like, no, it's a 7 out of 10. It's good, but...
It's not perfect.
It's not perfect, yeah.
Yeah.
It could be a lot better.
Which, and like a 7 out of 10, that's fine, certainly.
Yeah, no, that's still a great 40 minutes of TV. But it again goes back to that other thing I was saying, like, 7 out of 10? Trash. This is... Doctor Who.
Yeah,
this
so
is
I'm
bad
sorry.
Doctor Who.
I only watch Doctor Who episodes that get an 8.5 or higher.
It is amazing that a 7 out of 10 of regular television is like a 5 out of 10 for Doctor Who.
Yeah, I don't know whether that says more about the show or the fan base, to be honest, but I don't want to even begin to unpack that conundrum. But, I think it's not as good as I think we may have thought it was, and I'm glad, actually, that we were able to sort of sift through all of this to sort of get to that point. But again, it's still like a pretty solid episode, but now that we've gotten to the end of it, I realize, that's why I didn't remember it too well, because there are some flaws here, and especially with the story arcs.
Yeah, I still think it's got enough good moments that I still don't think is talked about enough, but it's definitely not worthy of being like...
Yeah, like...
we mentioned it falls right in the middle of Series 1 in terms of rankings. Again, that is about where it lands.
Yeah, I'd agree. Yeah, so I guess we can get on to the ratings of it. What would you give it?
Yep.
Yeah.
7.
I know, because I realize, I think we've only had one disparity with the Sea Devils, but I mean, I don't know. I hope we don't always agree on things so closely. I mean, it might make it a bit boring, but...
There's no chance.
Oh yeah, no, that's true. No, we're I think certainly by the time we get to Moffat's era, we are definitely going to be having some very interesting discussions at that point. So we'll see how that goes. But yeah, no, I think 7 is about fair for this.
Yeah. Have you decided what we're watching next week?
I'm still gonna have to. I'm leaning towards The Deadly Assassin, but I know what you said when you said you wanted it to be a not as great an episode, and I tried to look around thinking, oh, is there like a list of top 10 worst episodes? And then I just went through some of just some fairly random episodes from the classic series. I thought maybe I could show you Time Lash. I know that's voted as like one of the worst ever. That and the Twin Dilemma. I mean, I know there are a lot of Sixth Doctor episodes that aren't very well liked, so maybe one of them. But I am going to have to think on that a little bit more. I have to admit.
That's a bit fourth wall breaking, so we might cut that discussion out of the episode when it comes out.
Yeah.
Cool. So it's been another great discussion, and again, like for an episode that is very middle of the road, we had a lot to say.
This went for going on my end for 82 minutes as of now.
Yeah. It's probably been cut down for you guys, but we do talk quite a lot, and yeah, it's becoming more and more the weeks go on. So we'll see you next time for another Classic Who episode. We'll leave you with the mystery of what that's going to be. Until then, I've been Alex.
I've been Fitz.
And tally ho, Doctor Who fans. I'm experimenting with new outros.
Well, it's better than the last couple I've had. They were pretty lame, but I'm sure the audience is going to enjoy that. Anyway, see you later, fellow time travelers.
Yeah, not quite there yet.